Janine, could you read us a couple pages from your book?
Yes, I would love to. And I just want to thank you, Amy and Zach, for having me and for all the work you did to create this amazing event, and everyone who's here. Thank you so much for coming. What Amy said is just 100% true. What I was saying before everyone signed on is it's just, yeah, it's really hard to launch a book during a pandemic. And without these incredible events, it would be what I said, a giant bummer. So it's just really great that you're all here. I'm just going to read a little bit from the chapter called Baby Girl in the book. And this is the narrator is pregnant with her first child, and I really think that's all you need to know. Um, oh, well, except that the reason the chapter is called Baby Girl is that she takes in a stray cat at the beginning of the chapter and names that cat Baby Girl. So that's the reference there. I wish someone could have told me about the real surprise. How my daughter's gray, wondering eyes, when she first looked at me that August, would become like the beam of a lamp along Adrienne Rich's Something More Permanent. How her sweaty little head might point me toward the thing I had always been coming for. That would have been a comfort on those terror stricken mornings I spent alone, staring through empty chain link. But I had to find it out for myself when she finally arrived, my featherless bird, the girl who breathed first underwater, who lived first inside the wreck of me. She was the thing itself, more real than I could have known or dreamed. Her newborn hand, curled into a shell, was pressed to her mouth, itself a splendor, with her upper lip rippling perfectly over her gums with their delicate Epstein pearls. Beneath this yearning pink, shocking evidence of bone, a tiny chin, sharp and distinct. Exactly like yours, John said, but smaller. His own chin trembled then, and his brown eyes spilled the same salt water through which we both now swam madly toward this baby whose naked body pressed tight to my chest, even as the tide of her drew us farther and farther out, away from the shore we had stood upon only moments before, but now would never see again. This fathomless child was everything I had always known without knowing, everything I had ever grasped for in the dark. She was another world, humming and transparent, embracing and rocking us in her cradle of brine. We named our baby girl Sophia for the sheer beauty of it and because it means wisdom. She would give her lifelong love to the first baby girl, wrangling that little cat into ruffled doll dresses and walking her on a leash and reading her stories and coaxing her to drink from teacups and eventually, 17 years later, watching her die. Maybe healing when it happens is the result of a quantum entanglement, the swirling of 1,000 winds. Maybe it comes when you give your daughter your own heart, like another plush toy she will drag with her everywhere, clenching it in her baby fists whenever she screams in fear or sadness or pain, soaring through the air with it as she jumps from a swing at the highest possible point in the July sky, stuffing it into her backpack as she skulks off to high school on a bad day, locking herself away with it, broken, when her first love leaves her. All along, I would give Sophie the best thing I had other than my love, which was my words. I gave her all of them, filling her up as she nestled into the curve of my life. I would be awed when she grew up to be a writer too. Decades into the future, she would read my writing and with the utmost care examine each word, test its shape and weight before skipping it back across the water, counting how many times it bounced before slipping under. Thank you.
Thank you. Um, thank you. Um, all right, let's dive into how you created this incredible book. So one review of your book is describe the book. So it's a memoir, but the construction is so interesting. It's not I did this and then I did that and this happened. Someone described it as a shattered mirror, fragmented, kind of like the way memory is complicated and you can't quite figure out what's what. So as you wrote, you can tear a thing apart and tape it back together, and it will still be torn and whole. There is no other way. Can you describe the book's format?
Mhm.
Better than I did.
Amy, it was really, really a struggle finding the right format for this book. And I'll just say that, I did test other formats. I tested a more linear format. I tested it as a novel to see how that might feel, adding some, yeah, really fictionalizing some things, which it's a pretty it's a pretty vulnerable book. It's very exposing kind of book. So that felt safe in a way, like, oh, I could write this as fiction. um, but ultimately, while I was working on the book, I was working on it in pieces, some of which I was publishing along the way. And I had an opportunity in 2016 to work with Dorothy Allison at Tin House, and I worked with her on the piece Four Dogs, Maybe Five. And she asked if I was working on a book, and I told her that I had, these pieces, and they were in conversation with each other, and I could see that. I could see that they were building towards something. Something was happening, but they were all written separately, and they were covering some of the same, events. And she said, "Oh, that's how it works. That's how I wrote Bastard." And it was just so freeing and empowering to have her say that. And I feel like it gave me agency to go back into the material and experiment with what would happen if I allowed that to be a part of the book structure. What if that overlap isn't, what if I don't need to take all of that out, which is what I had done originally? What if I can actually, instead of taking the overlap out, look really carefully at the overlap and see how it might amplify what's happening in the book? And so that's what I ultimately did.
So for people who haven't had the pleasure of reading the book, and go buy it. And then, I mean, just sorry, I'm a fangirl. So the you for people who haven't read the book yet, can you explain how you vary the chapters? So there's one that's structured around dogs, like
Mhm.
five kinds of dogs, four maybe five kinds of dogs. Another around New Year's Eve's. I mean, the structure. I've never seen anything like it. Can you talk about that?
Um, well, yeah, I can talk about that. One of the things that you're noticing, I think, is some of the remnants of some of the writing constraints that I gave myself to access this material, which some of them are still evident in the book, and others have kind of fallen away in revision. But this was, again, it was really difficult material. So for those who haven't read the book, I'll just, it's not really a spoiler to say that a big part of what it deals with is recovering from um, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, mostly at the hands of my stepfather. But it doesn't, that those events themselves aren't really a big part of the book. It's really about the narrator's integration, and her like effort to become her whole self, in the aftermath of all of that as a young adult. And but that material was really, really hard to write, and I had tried many times to write about that, and failed. Like I couldn't do it in a way that felt successful to me, that I wanted it to be beautiful, and I wanted it to be something that would actually, yeah, something that a reader would receive as a gift, not a burden. And so that was a big struggle. And one of the ways that I found into that was through the use of some unconventional writing constraints. And I learned that from a teacher that I worked with. They're really common, but I didn't know that. I had never really worked with writing constraints, but I met a teacher who taught that way, and it really broke open my writing. So I would give myself these weird assignments, like the dogs were one of them. And I just thought, okay, I'm just going to focus on the dogs, And in the original version of that, there was a lot more about like the breeds themselves and sort of, factual information about all of the breeds. And then that fell away. But in other cases, like in Tumbleweeds, a lot of that factual information stayed, like about the jackalope and the botany, kind of the botanical information about tumbleweeds, or the breeding and child rearing habits of the Western meadowlark, that kind of stuff.
So, what do you mean by constraints?
hmm so a writing constraint is, in like literary terms, it just means that you put limitations on yourself. So instead of coming to the blank page, I find them incredibly useful just for overcoming writer's block, or yeah, there's a lot of science on this, but it's any kind of limitation that forces you to either follow a certain pattern or juxtapose different kinds of incongruities, which is mostly the way I worked with constraints. Although in Wingless Bodies, which is a chapter in the book, I required myself to write in iambic pentameter. So yeah, the whole thing isn't iambic pentameter, and you probably wouldn't notice it when you're reading it. But I worked with a musician on that piece. It was originally a performance piece. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to make myself write this in iambic pentameter. So poets are brilliant with, poetry is all about constraints, because there's form that you use in poetry, and you have to work with line breaks, and you have to keep bumping up. So I think of them as these walls that sort of box you in. And within that, you are engaging with a different kind of creativity. I think we know enough about creative and cognitive theory tells us that it is through that tension of pushing up against something else that our most creative impulses, are going to arise. And that was definitely true for me with this material. It was the key that allowed me to write about some of these really difficult things in a way that didn't feel too heavy, but still felt truthful. And also that didn't feel, it allowed me to see some of the other characters in a more complex way, because I had to get at the material a little bit at an angle. I couldn't like come right at it the way that I had always thought about it, for example. And just a really, really quick example of it is that I guess it's in, it is in Tumbleweeds. It's the last section of Tumbleweeds, but when I was working on that, I gave myself, one of the constraints that I used was that I had to take a passage of writing that I loved and try to write word for word for word and follow along that writer's, the sentence structure and the part of the speech.
I'm sorry. What do you mean? Can you give me?
So like, if you've ever taken a writing class, some of you may have been asked to do this, but you take a passage from a book and maybe the teacher would give it to you or you could give it to yourself. And in my case, I chose Annie Dillard's An American Childhood. And I think it's chapter 4 that starts out, "The boys were changing." That's the first line of that beautiful chapter of her beautiful book. And, any of you who know Annie Dillard's work and that particular book, she had a wonderful childhood. She just had a beautiful, wonderful, idyllic childhood. And so it couldn't have been more different from what I was trying to write. But this particular chapter, she's talking about, that era of the, maybe I think her childhood was more like in the 50s-ish. But anyway, that, kids ran free, the neighborhood kids would run together. And she started it out saying the boys were changing. And so I started my story and I said, my sister was changing. And it launched me, and then I followed along her words and the same number of words in the sentence. And I tried to match the parts of speech. And then eventually I got going and then it just fell away. But what that did that was so phenomenal for me is whenever I had tried to write about this particular time, in this section of the book, the narrator's mother has recently divorced the stepfather and they're taking in boarders, and it's just a really dark, chaotic time. And when I had tried to even think about, let alone write about that era of my childhood, the focus was always on the adults. And following, there was something about that constraint that launched me into the world of the child that tilted the whole thing. it cracked it open in a way that like, oh, this is it. This is how I can write about this. Yeah, so that's what a writing constraint is. And, you can even just like type it into Google writing constraints, and you can find some, one of the most famous groups that uses them is called the Oulipo Compendium in France. Italo Calvino wrote a whole novel without the letter E. Yeah, right.
I actually remember that. But, I did not read that, but I also mentioned that there is a version of Moby Dick which was written entirely in emojis.
Yeah, so there you go.
Start putting I see a couple of questions in the chat. Put some more. I'm going to ask one more of mine, or maybe two of my many, and then I'll get to the chat. But I really want to know, because you were talking about the point of view of a child. So look, the subject matter about which you wrote is painful, and the way you bring the reader into a child's incomprehension about what's going on is, I mean, how did you take an adult understanding of what you didn't understand as a child and make that work?
Well, actually a child narrator is another kind of constraint, right? Because if you limit yourself to, if I approached it really truthfully and I said, okay, so this child narrator can talk about what's happening, but I'm not going to let her explain anything that she didn't know, that she doesn't know in the moment. And I tried to mostly adhere to that. And, you can do a child narrator a lot of different ways. If you think about one of my favorite child narrators is Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. Just a brilliant example of a child narrator. But Scout, the way that Harper Lee writes Scout, I mean, if you just even read the opening to that novel, Scout is giving us the whole history of the town, right?
Right.
So, there's not one right way to do a child narrator, but I felt that I really needed to limit that narrator to only what she could understand, as much as possible. And that allowed, it allowed a certain amount of restraint in the material so that it could just, like that idea of just letting the events speak for themselves. The child doesn't understand the gravity of what's occurring. And I think that actually allows the reader, I hope, the idea was just to let the reader, feel that for themselves. And it doesn't really need to be explained.
It worked. It worked. All right, I have a lot of questions, but I want to go to the chat. So hang on, I'm not that good at this internet thing. Okay, so Janine, I have from Paige, I have a few questions. When did you begin writing the material that became this book? How did writing and eventually publishing the book affect and change your relationship with your daughter and other family members? And I should say that I don't think it's a spoiler to say that at some point your daughter actually puts her words into the book.
Mm-hmm. And that's my younger daughter. So that's the third child who I co-write an essay in the book with. But so the question is, when did I begin writing the material? That's just such a hard question to answer, because as I said, I had tried so many times. I had come at this material and come at it, and I did start writing really, fairly early in terms of publishing. I was publishing stuff in my 20s. I think my first like essay type thing came out when I was 23 or 24, and the children's book I was 27. But I could not write this stuff. I tried. So I was trying then, but I could tell that it wasn't where it wasn't anything I would want to put out there with my name on it. It wasn't, like I just knew it's like, this isn't working. It's not good. So, so this version of this material that actually became the book, I would say I started after I worked with the teacher I saw in the chat. Someone asked, his name was Paul Matthews, a British poet, and he lives in England. So it's not easy to study with him, but I worked as a middle and elementary school teacher for a long time, and it was in a Waldorf school, and he's a Waldorf teacher, and I was doing teacher training, and he was doing this 3-week workshop on, writing. So I took it as part of my teacher training, and I expected, like, I had no expectations. I just thought I was checking a box, for something I had to do for teacher training. And instead it just turned my writing life on its head, and in a really good way. But so I would say that was 2009, and it was after that that I started, playing with these stories, like really in a really playful way. Like, what if I did this, or what if I, you know, and using these constraints. Yeah, and so then I finished it while I was working on my MFA from 2015 to 2017. That's when I was very seriously engaged with the writing of it. And then I tried to, like I said, I had tried a more linear structure. So I tried the agent route for a little while, but kept getting feedback that, I mean, it's pretty, even with its slightly more linear structure, it was still really fragmented and really unconventional. So, I kind of had to face a crossroads of either to try to really make this conform to something a little bit more commercial, to have a good chance of having an agent represent it and be able to sell it, or let it be what I really wanted it to be, and keep it in that form. And so that's what I did, and sent it out to some small presses, and Split Lip loved it. So
And we love Split Lip. So, I mean, what a great fit. Okay, gosh, gosh darn it, people who showed up, I'm going to put my questions aside and listen to you. Okay, I find it so interesting that in discussing a memoir, you refer to the speaker as the narrator rather than myself. I'm new to writing workshops, talks. Is this common? How would you describe your closeness with this narrator?
Mm, what a great question.
Yeah.
And I do think of it as the narrator. And I was just talking to a writer. I teach writing, and I was talking to a writer this morning, and I was talking about her memoir, and I was talking about her narrator. And we were talking about how, because she's at that point in structuring her memoir where she really needs to figure out what the time span is, what the main narrative begins when and ends when, and what does that narrator really want, and how does she change. And we were talking about that, and I was listening to myself speak to her, and I thought, I feel like people who aren't writers would think we were crazy, talking about, like, because we're talking about herself, and myself, and we're talking about these people as if it's another person, and saying, well, I wonder, what did she really want, as if we don't know. And that's the beauty of it, because we don't know. We don't know ourselves the way that we think we do. We don't understand. If we all knew ourselves and our motives, and what's why we're doing the things that we do in the moment, our lives would just turn out perfectly, and we would never make any mistakes, and we would never deceive ourselves. And that's just not the case. So to go into your own story with a sense of not knowing, with a sense of real curiosity and real openness and inquisitiveness, and like a researcher, to say, what did this narrator actually want? What was really driving her choices? So I do think of the narrator as a separate, like when Joan Didion says she likes to stay on nodding terms with her past selves. It's kind of like that. It's like, this is a version of myself. It's a past self, but it's not, like, I do feel like we're evolving all the time, and we're not fixed, we're not static. So, and also then, just another aspect of that that's specifically related to writing, I guess that's all pretty psychological, but a self that's created for the page is in fact a narrated self, you know, because it's never going to capture the fullness and the full reality of our living self, in the same way that our writing can never fully, you know, Anne Patchett talks about we have this idea, it's this beautiful luminous thing, this beautiful luminous butterfly with wings, and it's, you know, ethereal and amazing. And in order to get it onto the page, we have to kill it. We pin it to the page, you know, and that's sad but true. And it's the same with the narrated self. It's a construction. And I think we're going for a true construction. I'm not saying that it's false or that it's intentionally concealing anything, but I think we have to acknowledge that we're presenting a version, you know, of ourselves that is serving the one story we're trying to tell. And um, and I'm about to stop, but and that's important to memoir too, because we are just telling one story. You know, a memoir isn't like the whole life. And that's why people can write more than one memoir. So then when they go in maybe to write about another aspect of life, that narrated self will more fully illuminate other aspects of that, you know, that writer, their core. So that's why I use that term. I think it is quite common. You know, I don't think it's super unusual, but for me, I'm quite, I feel, yeah, I'm a little bit probably more on the passionate side about that, that it is a narrator. It's me, a version of me, but it's a narrator.
I mean, that's,
Yeah.
I didn't want you to stop talking. I want you to talk the rest of the time. But I'm going to talk now and just say briefly that. So I was working with a critique partner today who was writing. She wrote a very personal piece, and I had that same issue where I was trying to say, you know, the author, the narrator, because it's not, because it is like a chosen. Someone fill in some words here. It's what you choose to put down. Okay, so Karen says, any suggestions for techniques to help create the beautiful imagery you shared in your reading?
Oh, thank you, Karen. Thank you for that. I have I saw something on Twitter yesterday that I shared with some of my favorite writers and writing students. And it was a writing teacher who said this. He said, he said essayists, but I think you could say writers in general. He said, beginning essayists often make the mistake of trying to tell about how fall makes them feel instead of trying to describe the first fallen leaf. And I thought that was very apropos and really beautiful, um, because if we can get that fallen leaf captured as precisely and specifically and vividly, you know, as possible, like if we can push ourselves to capture that thing as, you know, yes, I think precision is the best word, as precisely as possible, it kind of does the work for us of a lot of the feeling. I'm not saying that we're never going to talk about feelings, but I think those images can carry a lot of that work if we can really give our full attention to them. Like it takes some devotion, you know, to really look hard at something. But I think that's what it is. It's just, you know, one of my writing students is here tonight, so I feel like I'm like on repeat. But this idea of Marie Howe says that it pains us to look at the thing itself, like it bores us. It's hard. And but she says if we can do it, she's a beautiful poet. For those of you who don't know her work, Marie Howe, if we can just look long enough that it will open like a window. And so I think that's what I'm trying to do on the page. And I think if for the writer Karen who asked that question, if you just start there, you know, without, and yeah, I think that's where the best metaphors come from too, is when that thing opens like a window and all of a sudden it's like, oh, all the metaphors are already there. You know, we don't have to like create them or construct them on the page. They're already there all around us.
I'm sorry, I was lost in what you're saying. I'm supposed to be moderating. Let me get back to the chat. Um, Next up, we have M. Matthew, who says, for someone who's working on a coming of age novel, what plot structure would one adopt? Do you have any advice or recommendations on how one can structure the novel? What are some things to avoid?
Hmm, that's an interesting question. Well, I'm not a plot expert, and my memoir is pretty unconventional from a plot perspective. But I was talking this morning with this same writer about plot, and really, a lot of people, and I would fall in this camp, believe that plot boils down to someone wants something, and so desire is at the heart of plot. Ernest Hemingway, I think, was the one who said your protagonist has to want something, even if it's just a drink of water. Like someone has to want something very much, and then they're either going to get it or not. And then that's going to have consequences. And so plot is just the sequence of events, and there's some causality, because usually when the person at the heart of the story wants something, then they're going to do something to try to get that thing. So there's causality. That's the narrative drive. And what they want can be something internal. In the case of my memoir, it is, the narrator is filled with desire, but it's all pretty internal. So I think those are good questions. Somebody put it this way: there's like a sort of sentence you can fill in, which is, "My story is about blank who wants blank. It begins here and ends there." And if you can just kind of start thinking about your plot in that really simple way, it's deceivingly simple because it can be hard to boil it down, right, to that um, to that level of clarity, but it's a great place to start, or at least, or maybe even a great thing to keep returning to as you work on the structure. I hope that's helpful.
Yes. Um, all right.
Amy, can I say one more quick thing about the narrator and the
You
narrated
can
self?
say a long thing about the narrative.
It'll just be a quick one. I just wanted to say that that also makes it. Like I've said a couple of times, I teach writing, and I find it to be a much safer, more respectful way to talk about writing in a group of writers. When writers can be talking with each other about what's going on the page, even when it's nonfiction, with the narrator versus because we write about some
Yeah,
things that are
that's interesting.
very personal, um, and also even if it's not traumatic or really sensitive, our writing is already an extension of us. Like, we are sort of what we write. So when we're talking about you, when we're talking about someone else's writing, it just kind of really further obliterates that line between ourselves and our work. So I think, yeah, I just think it's really a respectful way for writers to talk about each other's writing. Okay, now we can go on to the other question.
I'd like to take, there's a question from Deb and Ellen, and I want to combine them. The questions are, why did you choose this slice of your life to expose? And can you talk about the process of shielding? That is, anyone you didn't want to write about to protect their privacy, or because you feared they might be upset about what you wanted to reveal, like what happened to the writer of Education. So basically, I'm going to reinterpret these two questions as saying, this is some personal painful stuff. So how, as a writer, because I want to, stick with the writing, do you balance what you want to write, how I don't know, pretend I asked you a really intelligent question about the process of exposing some painful things about people in your lives.
Mhm. Um, well, that's a question we all worry about, right? And I would just say, for those who are writers or trying to write in the group, there is a book edited by Joy Castro called Family Trouble. And it's writers writing on this question of how do we write about our lives. And one of the wonderful things about that book is that there is no right answer. There's absolutely zero right answers to this question other than the legal stuff, which I'm not a literary attorney and I'm not going to get into that. That's something each, writer needs to negotiate for themselves, the legal stuff. But as far as the moral, ethical, relational things, there is not a right answer because it's always going to depend on the context of that writer's relationships. But in my case, I have a author's note disclaimer type thing in the memoir. I removed a sister. It was an agreement that we made, my older sister, and it would have, I absolutely believe would have been a better book with her in it, because I'm a middle child, and I think I come across in the narrative way too much like an oldest because it's kind of how it's, without her there. But she has been supportive quietly, she's not mad at me. But she was mad at me when I first started publishing some of these stories. And we really had to work it out. I was shocked. I did not expect that. I figured, I was prepared to have to deal with some challenges with my mom around the manuscript, but not my sister. I thought we were like on the same page. So that was surprising and we had to work it out, but I really value that relationship. So I was just like, oh, okay, I'm just not gonna, she's just very, very private. She doesn't contest the truth of anything. We went through it all together. So that's an example. And another example is that I ended my book I ended it when I did, which is sort of when the narrator is transitioning from her first marriage to a new relationship. And I don't include, there's very little mention of my second current husband. We have a blended family. There are 6 kids, my 3 and his 3. So my 3 stepkids, there are grandchildren now. We have 4 little grandchildren. And I didn't feel like any of that was integral enough to the central conflict of this story to risk. It was a hard time that we went through a really messy divorce, and I didn't feel like doing any more. I didn't, yeah, I didn't want us all to have to relive that through my book. So I didn't. um, and then last of all, my mom, I just saw my mom yesterday. I went to with my daughter, the one who I co-wrote an essay with in the book, to drop off a medical device for my mom, who has, for anyone in the room who has read the book, my mom is back in Minneapolis. She moved herself back. And so we dropped off this medical device, and she knows about the book, and I just sort of asked her, can we just not have to have this be a conflict? These are, I kind of used the same thing that we were talking about earlier. Like, these are past versions of ourselves, and these things happened and now they're over. And this writing was such an important part of my own becoming. Like, it was urgent. Like, I had to write this book. I've been trying for decades. I could never quite put it down. I could never give up on writing it. So it was definitely a part of my process of becoming more fully who I am and more whole. And I think, yeah, so it seems like, knock on wood, for the most part, the collateral damage has been, little to none. And maybe it helped that I was working on some of these stories, and publishing some of them. So that gave us a chance to work out all those kinks before the actual book came out.
Um, this is so interesting. Okay. Personal narrative out, Amy. What is from Paige, what is your writing routine? When and where do you write? What surrounds you in your workspace? How has your routine evolved over the years? And I'm going to throw in a question about the pandemic, because it's not so easy to write for some of us.
Yeah. Well, I had kids young. I was 22 when Sophie was born, and I had 3 kids in 5 years. So, and when I was 27, when my youngest was a baby, I took a position as editor of a local magazine. The magazine is called Minnesota Parent. It was different then. Um, and I was able to, it was a really cool situation because I was able to, we were publishing essays and fiction and poetry. It became like kind of like a literary journal style of a parenting magazine. And I did that for 3 years, and my kids were little. Um, and I think that acclimated me to writing in the middle of chaos. And I think Shirley Jackson has said that, I think she wrote her stories like on the washer, like leaning up against the washing machine writing, while the kids were little. And so I can write, yeah, I write in the middle of life. And I don't have a really strong writing routine where like some people have they get up and they do this much in the morning and so forth. I don't have that. I always wish I were that kind of writer. I think I have such an admiration for that, and it sounds just wonderful. But that's not me. I'm a binge writer. So, and I do better work if I can be in it for a really long time. And that's definitely how I worked on this manuscript. I would, yeah. Um, I think there's like like what Marie House says about if you sit with something long enough, it opens like a window. For me, the work is like that. So if I can just press on and stay with it long enough, then the world I'm in becomes real. And then all the sorts of interesting things start to happen on the page. And then as far as the pandemic goes, Amy, um, the saving grace for me during the pandemic has mostly been my teaching, because I created a workshop at the beginning of the pandemic. I created it in March of last year and I think the first one started in April, called Writing in the Dark.
Mhm.
And so the subtitle of the workshop is Survival Strategies for Creating in Uncertain Times. And so we just look really carefully at short work and use these inspirations to write short work. And yeah, it's been an incredible group of writers that has cycled in and out of that workshop. It's a 6-week workshop, and it has just kept, going and going. And a lot of writers have like taken it all 5 sessions, and then, other writers have cycled in and out. But that has kept me tethered to
So
creative practice.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you give the title of that again? So Zach, if you're still here, can you throw it in the chat, or we'll throw it in the chat at the end? What is it called?
It's called Writing in the Dark.
Okay, Writing in the Dark. We don't need to throw that in the chat. Writing in the Dark.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sitting here. The room is lit, but the 12,000 square feet is dark. Writing in the Dark. Thank you. So I am not particularly good at chat windows, so I'm going to go. If I miss your question, then put it back in. Oh, interesting. Alexis, how slim do you think the chance of getting an agent with a non-traditional form memoir? Would you recommend just skipping the route altogether and focus energy on small presses only?
I don't think so. I may have stuck it out longer if I were younger and not so urgent about this particular book. And I know I have other books in me, but this was my thought process. I had probably 3 or 4 agents seriously interested, like they looked at pages, they said, I want to see the full. One of those agents was even interested enough, was like close enough to like actually look at a revision. So like they really liked the writing, and I knew that. And the way that agents talk now, if you know the numbers, like, they have a really hard job, and they have to really love something and really think they can sell it. Because they're not getting paid until they sell it. And they're getting something like at AWP a few years ago, the one that was in Tampa, I think Jeff Kleinman was saying, like, I don't know, this might be too much, but I want to say that they get like 1,000 queries a month or something, and an agent having a good year might sell like 3 manuscripts. So it's just the numbers are kind of grim. And I just felt like at the time that I made the decision to submit it to independent presses, I was 51, and I just thought, well, and I'm in a lot of writers groups where also I know that the possibility of an agent taking the manuscript, okay, I love it enough to take it, but then they try for a couple of years and can't sell it. So it wasn't that I didn't believe in the book or think that maybe it was possible, but I also had to acknowledge that I might be tacking on another, 5 years to the process without a guarantee that that would end in a book. So I felt like I really believed in the book, and I felt like it would find a good home at a small press. And I felt like I also had some good mentors. When in grad school, I worked with Sue Williams Silverman, and I spoke to her a little bit about it, and she has gone both routes. And in fact, a few of my advisors had both, and loved their small presses and were very encouraging. And so I thought, yeah, I'm going to do that. And like within a couple of months it sold. So I felt like, okay, yeah, that was the right choice. And I've loved working with Split Lip. And so the novel I'm working on now, I probably will try again, to go the agent route, and we'll see what happens. But I think, it's very situational. Had I been in my 20s or 30s, I might have said, oh, I'm going to sit on it. I'll see. Like, I didn't go through, like, people will say, oh, you have to be willing to query about 100 agents. And I think I probably queried like 12. So I didn't try very hard, but because the ones that looked at it so seriously, and I just kind of trusted their instincts, and agents will always say it, there'll be somebody out there, don't give up, there'll be another agent who's going to love this. And maybe that was true. But I also I also felt really very happy with working with a small press.
I mean, that's a whole other discussion. I mean, Split Lip. If you're on here, Split Lip, we love you. Um, okay, we're running out of time. Okay. From Paige, writing personal stories it seems like such a cathartic experience. Like you said, the process of becoming whole in who you are. What do you hope readers will take away from your memoir? How did you keep that in mind while writing? Did you keep it in mind? I'll ask.
Hmm. Well, I definitely kept the reader in mind. Um, Primarily, as I said earlier, that I wanted to create something that had light in it, even though it was dealing with heavy subjects. I wanted it to feel, I mean, I read sad books. I read, so sometimes I mean, I'm probably drawn toward it, and it can just give you, it's like homeopathic. It just can give you the most wonderful feeling. So I wanted that. But I don't think that I was creating a message per se, except that I think that line that you read, Amy, that you can tear a thing apart and it will still be torn and whole. I think maybe if there's anything that was really important to me in the book that I hoped would really come through, is this idea that we can be both broken and whole. Like, I think there is no other way. Like, I really believe that. And I don't think that things, I don't think we eradicate our experiences. I think we integrate them. And I think that is really what healing looks like. And we probably all have something like that, in our path, in our history. And that, so I think that epigenetics, which is what the last chapter of the book deals with, I think that is the hopeful part of epigenetics, is that, yeah, there's sort of, we carry these things and we can even carry them intergenerationally, but we also, carry our own self-will and agency. And that goes a long way toward, how these experiences uh, interact with who we are. And then I would just tack on to that, that comes from, I feel like, whenever I talk about that, I feel like I have to clarify, like, that comes from a place of speaking from great privilege. It is a privilege to be able to write stories and do this kind of work and have access to the time and the space, and the, just in this world we're living in, just to have your basic needs, your physical needs, for heat and food and shelter. Um, that's the starting point. So when I say the things I'm saying, it's starting with recognizing that not everyone has that, and there are experiences that, yeah, I think we all know, that, yeah, that's starting from a certain place that we're very fortunate to be in.
Right. I mean, even being on this chat, right?
Right.
Right. I think we're going to go maybe with one more question, and then okay, this is interesting because I think memory is complicated. So the question is, what is ethical when you as a writer remember something as true and others insist it is not? And I personally think that we can all look at the same thing and have completely different experiences. So
Hmm. I mean, eyewitness accounts research tells us that, right? The truth is subjective. So our experience, we bring a certain lens to our experience we're primed. It's called in brain science, it's called priming. And everyone's brain is primed based on our previous experience to take in a new experience in a particular way. And that's going to be, a whole combination of things based on the cumulative impact of every other thing we've experienced before. And that's why we all know this, like at family gatherings, siblings never agree on exactly what happened. There's always argument around that. And like those were some sticking points with my sister. Like there's this one point, it was so funny, interesting. Like she didn't have any argument with the basic truths, but there were certain things like, why would you say that they got purple satin sheets? That's so like, why would you make that up? And I was like, but I didn't make that up. Like they did get purple satin sheets. I remember that. And I'm pretty sure I do. I believe that. I stand by it, but no one is ever really going to know. We can't go back to Casper, Wyoming in the year 1974 and check that. But I'm really sure about it. But so it's stuff like that. And I think, for me, the question to the ethics is I felt like that. I mean, that's a minor detail. My sister thought it was a little bit like salacious, kind of like made my mom and our stepdad seem even like creepier. But for me, it was just a detail. It just was what it was. But all of those sorts of things are just, kind of minor. But I think with big things, my feeling is that if it's going to cast someone in a negative light and could be hurtful because of that, then it's really, really important to look really hard at that subjectivity when it comes to the truth and just be really rigorous about that. Yeah, because, there's objective truth. Like my stepfather is a convicted sex felon. That's an objective fact. It's just true. You know, yeah. So I think when there are things, yeah, that I do think that Anne Lamott says, as you all probably know, if people wanted you to write about them more warmly, they should have behaved better. And it's a great line and it's a fun one to repeat, but I also think it's only part of the truth. So one of the big things that I did in revision of this manuscript, every single revision, I looked for places to show some of the characters in my book who did hurtful things, that some of the people in the book by whom the narrator was hurt, those are the people I focused the most on trying to show in their best possible light, to find every opportunity to show them, yeah, to show the good side of those characters. And I don't regret that. That was really time well spent. So that's one piece of advice I might give, is just to, you know, part of the ethics is, biology has it so that it's a survival thing. We remember what hurt us, but there's generally more to the story, so can we press a little harder to find, those other, yeah, those other rays of light that might, and then it makes for a better story because it's more true. The characters are more complicated because that's how life is.
And that's a wrap. Um, buy the book, buy the book, buy the book. It's everything Janine has been in person, and it's you. Yeah. Thank you. This has been really interesting. If you could stick around for 2 minutes after, we're at time, but there was a question about small press versus self-publishing, and speaking at the Writer Center, supporting writers and people who want to write. The world of publishing is so complicated, and if you could spend like 3 minutes explaining self-publishing versus small press, because they're quite different, that would be great. But if not, if people don't want to stay, fairly well.
I haven't self-published, so I don't have expertise, but I have worked with writers as a writing teacher and mentor who have self-published. And I think a big part of it is what your goals are. So I think being able to try to look carefully at what is it that you really want from writing the book. If what you want, if what's most important is to, I think so that, and it could be many things. It could be the most important thing might be just getting the book into the world, or the most important thing for some writers is actually trying to make money on a book. Ha 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 ha. But it is theoretically, supposedly, some writers do make money on books, so I guess that's possible. And a lot of writers will tell you in writers groups right now that the best way to make money on a book is to self-publish it. So I don't know, I can't say with authority whether that's true or not. I think that really depends on if you have marketing savvy, and are willing to do all of that work. It's not going to happen if you just self-publish it. Nothing will happen. No one will know about it and no one will buy it. But that said, even traditionally published authors have to do a lot of their own work, a lot of boots on the ground work to promote their books. And so that's on every writer, not just self-published writers. So I think it really boils down to what you most want. And for me, because I teach and am a participant in the literary community, it felt really important I wanted the process of a press. I didn't want and I had no desire or interest in like the business side of figuring out my own, publishing process. It was wonderful to not have to worry about any of that, because the promotion part of it is, at least that's one thing, but the whole finances of like printing, and I don't even know how all of that works, and I don't really want to know. So I think it kind of depends on, what you want and what, people ask that same question. It's a question that I get sometimes, and all writers do. If you have an MFA, people will say, well, is it worth it? Do I need an MFA? Should I get an MFA? Or, can I write without one? And I would always say, absolutely, you can write without an MFA. There's nobody has to go out and get an MFA. There's lots of ways to write and to become better at writing and to take the craft seriously that can happen outside of the MFA. For me, it was worthwhile because I work in a university, and universities are really hierarchical, and I didn't have an undergraduate degree. So that MFA meant a lot. And so it was worth the cost, it was worth the time, and it was also, a lovely way to really make friends and in the literary community, important relationships. So, but that's very particular to my situation and my needs. And there might have been other ways to do that if I weren't working in a university that, would have been maybe less costly and and more efficient. And I think publishing, it's the same thing. It's like there isn't a right answer, but it's about knowing really. Yeah, it's that same question back to the narrator, like what does the narrator really want here, and to be honest about that, because there is a still some um you know I don't, what is the right word, there is still some delineation, I feel like, in the world between a curated process, which is, where you have to get through all the gatekeepers, and then somebody has to say, yes, I'm going to get behind this and publish this book, and publishing yourself, similarly to the difference between blogging and submitting your work to journals and going through the humiliating rejection process until you finally get your yes. And so for some of us, that you could call it validation or something, to have the work selected and yeah, is important, but for somebody else it might not be. And so, and that's fine too. So, but to be honest about that, so I'm just here to say, okay, I can admit that for me, that validation, like I wanted that. I wanted somebody to say to me, I love your book, I want to publish it. But if for someone else that's not an issue, I say go you, because self-publishing is becoming more and more and more viable. So that's my answer.
Um, all right. I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you. Um, thank everybody for coming. We have I think the technical word is a crap ton of other events coming up with amazing authors like this. And I hope to see you soon in person. Thank you, Janine. This was just, someone give me a word. Wonderful.
Thank you so, so much. Thank you everyone again for coming. It really means so much. And thank you, Amy and Zach and the Writers Center. What a great event, really fun. Thank you all for your great questions.